All right, I think we're going to get started. A couple of weeks ago, maybe about a month and a half ago, I had the honor of interviewing Gurudev Sri Sri Ravi Shankar. He's a spiritual leader from India. And during the VIP reception, I got the chance to meet somebody who I just thought was one of the most fascinating people I'd ever met in my entire life, and that's Tom Gregoire. We ended up having a conversation, at one of the events. Then we talked a little bit later, and then we've had the chance to meet for coffee a couple of times. And just throughout those conversations, it was absolutely clear to me that I was in the presence of somebody who'd spent just an inspiring career thinking about some of the most fascinating topics about how we work with one another, how we are with one another. I think it's rare to find somebody who engages with these kinds of ideas with just such an intense personal commitment and so much integrity and just so much wisdom. And so I'm really grateful to Jill for introducing us. And I'm so grateful, to you, Tom, for the chance that I've had to get to know you and learn from you and speak with you. So thank you for being here.
You need to get out more.
I need to get out more, yeah. But I'll do a brief introduction for those of you who don't know Tom. So Tom Gregoire is Dean Emeritus and Associate Professor at The Ohio State University College of Social Work, having conducted 20 years of academic leadership in multiple roles at Ohio State, including 13 years as Dean of the College of Social Work. He was a member of the Shared Values Initiative Steering Committee. Prior to his academic career, Tom spent 9 years as a clinician and then administrator to a group of addiction treatment programs located across Kansas and Oklahoma. Tom's approach to leadership emphasizes the promotion of collaboration, innovation, and creative risk-taking, and the recognition that it matters how we engage together as a community. To that end, he has employed innovative methodologies to promote creative dialogue across highly diverse groups in the academy and the community. Tom is a practitioner and proponent of mindfulness as a tool for enhancing both personal well-being and organizational effectiveness. So the first thing that I'd like to do is I'd like to ask you to, if you'd be willing to tell me, to kind of tell us a story that you told me one of the first times we met. This is a story about an event that happened back in 1978 when a professor really took the time to meet you where you were at and give you some assignments that changed your life.
Yeah, that sounds great. And that came up because he was a philosophy professor, Piers. So in 1978, I was considerably younger, and in my third undergrad, having drugged and drank my way out of the other two, I had a serious substance use disorder. So I moved to Kansas because it was far away from everything I was getting in trouble with, and the only problem is when I packed myself. So I came along and fairly quickly found myself getting in trouble again. And there's actually two people I want to mention, but we'll focus on the philosophy professor. Not knowing what to do, I scheduled 3 appointments with one of my faculty members who taught courses on the addictions, and the first 2 I scheduled 2. I went to the first 2, lost my nerve, and just kind of bullshit my way through the meeting. The third meeting, I just barged into his office and said, I need help, because he was somebody who, a term we didn't have in 78, but we have now, he was recovering out loud. I knew he was in recovery. That led to me getting the help I needed. I wound up in a hospital for 32 days. The next semester was starting, and we had to go see all of our professors, and I didn't tell them, hey, I'm going to be a week late. Here's why. Everybody's very supportive. But I sit with a philosophy professor fairly early in his career named Robert Imperato, and Dr. Imperato says to me, I don't know a lot about addiction, but I understand a lot about what I think this kind of existential journey you might be about to go on. Would you like to have different readings and different assignments for this course? And it was just perfectly timed for me, and things I needed in my recovery. I had to drive for spring break from Kansas to Maryland, straight through and back, and I had an assignment related to that. It said, no music, no passengers, think about yourself, learn to be alone with yourself, and then I had to write a paper about that. So that all happened in 1979 for that course, and it really set me on a healthy path. As I was leaving my deanship, I thought about him a lot, and I often told this story, and I'd like for this to show up in my own teaching practice. But I got to thinking about him more and more as I was closing a chapter on my deanship, and I thought, I need to find this man, and I'd found him. And he had recently retired within the last year or two. It was just a few emails we traded. But he wrote me back, and I started with, "You don't remember me, but," and he said, I did remember you. And I told him how my life unfolded and how he was such a big part of that. And he wrote me back and said, "I'm in a period in my life where I'm wondering if what I did mattered." And so as I get a lump in my throat telling you that story, there's just a mutuality of that. He met me where I was at the time I needed that, as did the other faculty member, and that we could connect 40 years later was really...
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. You talk about him meeting you where you were at, and that was one of the things that was so inspiring the first time I met you. Like, you were able to tell this story about being met where you were at in such a salient way. I'm wondering if you could tell me about ways that approach of meeting people where they're at has manifested in your own teaching.
Yeah, I think not forgetting, first is not forgetting the people that impacted me. I think I view my teaching as a lineage. What was offered to me that was helpful, I find myself occasionally saying and doing things that were done. And, I just came back from our conference for social work educators Sunday night, and among the things I got to do is about an hour with each of them of 6 former doctoral students of mine, some of them from 20 years ago. And so it was nice to sort of refresh and experience that lineage as well too. But so much of it is meeting students where they are and seeing students and everybody that's in your world as other than their label. You're not just a student, you're not just a faculty member, you're not just a staff. You're a living, breathing human being, and I'm occupying the same space.
Yeah. So one thing that we've talked a lot about in our conversations have been hierarchies. Formal hierarchies, informal hierarchies, healthy hierarchies, unhealthy hierarchies. And what I just heard you say was that when you're interacting with people, you want to make sure that you're interacting with them as the person who's in front of you, rather than just seeing them as like a student or as like a staff member or whatever other role they might have within the hierarchies of universities or wherever else you're working. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how hierarchical structures can either enable us to interact with the human behind the label or get in the way of that.
That's a really good point. So I have 26 years of leadership experience in hierarchy, and this is an incredibly complex organization. The hospital system I worked in was very complicated. As near as I can tell, complex organizations need a hierarchy, and we've all seen an organizational chart. I think hierarchy has the potential to articulate power and role and responsibility and relationship. Maybe there are some scholars of hierarchy here. I'm a practitioner, but the hierarchies probably when we were organizing military, 10, 20, 1,000 years ago, when all of a sudden you needed everybody to run in the same direction at the same time, as agriculture became more than an individual experience, and the Industrial Revolution. And there's a lot of there's a lot of ways. There's matrix hierarchies. There's flat hierarchies. People think a lot about how hierarchies engage. And the design of that all matters, but it's how, for me, what matters to me at this point is how we live and work in all those little diagrams. It's how we engage with each other. Yeah, maybe this is a better diagram, that's a better diagram, that's a better organization, but it's also true that how we live and how we relate to each other and all these little diagrams matter. And the function's different. Hierarchies are originally thought of as like command and control. When you had an industrial revolution, everybody needed to show up at the same time, and whatever. But in a creative organization, I don't know that command and control is particularly helpful. If our aspiration is innovation and creativity, which it is here, which it is in most professional contexts, hierarchy can't just be command and control.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing you saying is that you can have like organizational charts with a bunch of different ways of thinking about like kind of how we arrange people in different roles, in different people. Some people give orders, some people are receiving orders. There's this military metaphor. In creative organizations, there might be a different goal for the hierarchy than some people, the command and control that we see in the military.
I think that's right. And I haven't been in the military. I have a number of family members in the military, so I've experienced it vicariously. I don't hold this out as, I think there are aspects of the military that are tremendously creative, but I've worked in two of the military, healthcare, and higher ed, or maybe some of the more hierarchical organizations one can work in. In the first two, hierarchy is much more explicit, right? You can tell from 30 feet away by what's here and what's here where somebody fits in the hierarchy. Once you hang around a healthcare organization long enough, colors of scrubs, lengths of lab coats, all kinds of things like that make hierarchy explicit. It operates on you less explicitly in higher ed. We know about academic rank, we know about all of those things, but we're not always intentional about it. It's much more implicit, and so it can be problematic in that respect.
It can be problematic when it's implicit, because there's expectations that people have for one another or for themselves that aren't ever actually fully written down. So maybe you cross a line, you didn't know it was there. You have, and I'm wondering if this is another way that it could be a problem. Elizabeth Anderson talks about hierarchies of authority, esteem, and standing as being different types of pernicious hierarchies. And so for a hierarchy of authority, some people have arbitrary and unaccountable power over others. In a hierarchy of esteem, you have some people who bow and scrape before others. You have to address somebody with a certain, higher title with you, with a whole lot of deference, and other people are kind of denigrated. And then with this hierarchy of standing, some people have a voice, some people have a vote towards the future organization of the institution, and others don't.
Yeah, I think all of that's right, and I'll add maybe another. Again, I told you I'm a practitioner, not a theorist in this context, but how predictable is a hierarchy? When I enter a hierarchy, does it behave the same way all the time? Can I come to know how things work? Can I come to know where to get what I need? Hierarchy is about getting the support I need. It's about setting vision. Can I know who to talk to have input and all of that? I think the most ineffective hierarchies are those that are really unpredictable, and it happens in the academy often. I think one of the roles of leadership is to kind of expose that or make it more predictable. You never know when somebody might pull rank with you or not, when somebody might engage in something or not. So those, if you're calling them pernicious hierarchies, those ones that are kind of hard to interrogate, that are unpredictable, you don't know, you didn't see that yet. When you leave a meeting and say, I didn't see that coming, you were operating in a kind of an unpredictable hierarchy.
One point you made a little bit earlier that I want to return to is this idea that we have different hierarchies organized for different functions, where perhaps in the military we need to have, it's about command and control. Can I get troops from point A to point B efficiently without questioning the orders? In a creative organization, we want to be able to empower people to explore. And when I think about arts organizations, I've spent a lot of time in arts organizations. I've seen very different hierarchies even in symphony orchestras. So for most orchestras, if you're a violinist, if nobody in the audience notices that you were there, there's a sense in which you did a good job, because it means that you didn't stick out, you played with the section, you took orders effortlessly, you were very efficient at taking bowings from the top of the front stand back to the back stand. But there isn't really that much of an opportunity to engage in individual creative expression. It's a very kind of rigid, homogenizing process. There's other orchestras, though. I think the Budapest Festival Orchestra is one example of this, where when you get a new violinist in the orchestra, there was one conductor there who was famous for saying, oh, what are you passionate about? Are you interested in Baroque music? Maybe we can have you organize like a Baroque concert. And it still has the type of hierarchy that we need in order to have rigorous, clear, concise communications of instructions from the front to the back when that's necessary. But there's also these institutionally designed elements that allow people to actually be creative and actually do this kind of exploration. And I'm wondering, like, what the analog of that is in a university.
Yeah,
what does it look like to have enough, clarity and rigidity and top-down communication so that we can actually be agile and have things come from the top to the bottom, but that still allows for the creativity and empowers people to be creative and innovative?
That's a really good example. I like that a lot. To the extent that hierarchy is an effort to kind of control chaos, it's a problem in a creative organization. Creativity has to be a bit chaotic, right? And so you can get, if a hierarchy impedes chaos, if it funnels and provides direction and helps chaos become product, okay. But if it impedes chaos, that's a concern. A hierarchy is often thought about, let's bring certainty. Let's make sure everybody knows what to do. In a creative organization, uncertainty is required. It has to be tolerable as well too. So, and there's somewhere in here, there's what came up to me as you were talking about your violin, but then it went away because I thought, well, maybe it doesn't fit. But hierarchy impacts process and product, and the process of how we do our work is perhaps more important. Everything we're going to talk about today could fall in between these two dimensions of not too tight and not too loose, and that's the answer to everything. So.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So you're talking about process being important as well as your product. It's not simply important that we have creative products at the end. You want to have a process that is itself an expression of individual creativity and agency. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I think that's right. Outside our research office and social work, there's a research officer that has this a poster or whatever that says play is the highest form of research. And an organization needs to allow for play. It needs to allow for fun, for the enthusiasm and the excitement that comes with creativity.
Yeah, I love that. There's this picture that's emerging in my head where we're trying to navigate between order and chaos. We're trying to navigate between the kind of playful, chaotic impulse and the ordered, rigid, efficient, clear impulse. And it seems like the hierarchies that you like are ones that give us a good balance of those two things, that kind of make chaos, that kind of rein chaos in enough that we're still able to do our job, but still keep it alive enough that we're able to benefit from its fruits.
I think that's right. And I think you're describing the leadership's touch here. When is it time to decide? What is needed here? There just has to be a deft touch by leadership in any creative process that helps move us forward and does. And, if you haven't been in an organization where what I'm about to describe happens, awesome. But many of us have been in organizations where we can't make a damn decision. Nothing ever happens. And that gets tiring after a while too. And so there's a deft touch in there about both creating a structure in which we can create, but also when is it time to move forward, and doing that with clarity. And perhaps we'll talk about that more in a little bit under some other questions you have for me. But people understanding about how we're going to decide, maybe even when we're going to decide, that's required.
Yeah. Well, let's transition to leadership. So. You talked about a good leader being somebody who helps us actually make decisions happen, but not in a way that crushes the chaotic creative impulse. Mm-hmm. How should leaders do that?
I think you have to build community and trust. People have, when you say to somebody, when you sort of charge them or encourage them, they have to know you're going to be there and the resources going to be there. One of the things, and I see another fellow long-term dean here, one of the things a dean learns in this organization, at least I did, 3 buckets every innovation falls into. That's cool, and it'll be good for the college I'm in. I don't like that, but we better comply, and that don't have legs. Somebody's throwing out an idea that's long-term not going to be supported. there's not it's just a wild idea, and I like wild ideas, but what's its path forward? And thinking about this shared values initiative, so I was invited onto this at the beginning, and I kind of interrogated that invitation with this, and it was easy to see that there was a clear commitment of the university. There were the resources there was some energy around that, but as a leader, I contrast leadership in the academy versus leadership in the hospital system I was in. In the academy, leadership's an invitation. Nobody has to come. When you're tenured, you do what the heck you want, more or less, right? And so a leadership toward the products we produce in the academy has to be an invitation and not a command. Yeah, I get there's commands. I mean, I don't want to minimize that. It's you need to teach these many courses, whatever it might be. But leadership ultimately is into really cool and fun processes is an invitation.
I wonder if you could just be more specific. So let's think about some invitations that might allow us to achieve greater efficiency without killing the creative impulse.
There has to be, leadership. Hopefully, invitation is attached to vision and mission, and it feels relevant. I think that people that are attracted to the academy are attracted to. Well, let me pause. Everybody has a different venue, so sometimes my invitation is to people who are really competitive, and then that invitation is, I think we could get ahead of them if we did this. Sometimes the invitation is to people who are just really creative, and then the invitation is, what do you think about this? And it's bringing different pieces together. What if we talk to them? I mean, a lot of invitation starts with what if. Invitation comes with commitment as well, too. A lot of the, I'll go back to an early invitation we made. I think we've seen our life cycle of iPads here in the university, but they started at social work, and we were the first college to roll that out to everybody. But we made the invitation in a couple of ways. We made it a source of pride. You can go on. I mean, it would make you laugh now because nobody had iPads then, but. There's on our YouTube channel, there's probably still a filming of the big event. You had to come. We made it an event. We had an executive vice president from Apple come in. We trained you in how to use an iPad as an educational tool. We made seed grants available that you could get iPads in the community, all of that. So, and there were a couple elements of that. So there was some excitement about it for those people. There was some competitiveness about it for those people. There was innovation about it for those folks. And then we also made it feel attainable. So I'll run with the story just a little bit. Back in that day, we were trying to bring more technology into our education. And we would bring in these experts, and they would do a lecture and show this really cool shit that they'd done. But what happened, we looked at this, meaning all our community, and said, either I don't have time for that, or I don't have knowledge for that. And so we were valuing stuff that was not attainable. So leadership is also an invitation to the next attainable step. So then those seed grants then became they weren't small things, but like somebody wrote a seed grant, sent an iPad out into the community, the practice community that traveled around. And when she lectured on a topic, again, 2012, which she would lecture on a topic for the first hour, a practice topic, and then the students would engage with sometimes clients, but also the agency specifically in a FaceTime. So a simple thing that was really pretty impactful. There's a lot of examples around that. So a good invitation. You get invited to stuff and think you have to go, and you get invited to stuff like, whoa. We try to do whoa. But then we make sure people know there's going to be food at the party. There's a food and drink or whatever it might be, and this party's going to last. And you don't have to. It's not going to be a party where you feel like I don't have anything to wear. We're trying to check all those boxes in a good invitation.
Yeah, that's helpful. One thing that I'm reminded of when I hear you talk about invitations as being the ways that you lead within a creative organization, especially like a university, is this idea that I got from David Kennedy, who's a philosopher of education, does a lot of work with children. And when you're working with young children in a classroom, you have to figure out a way of imposing without imposing fully. When you impose fully upon them and you just kind of enforce your vision of what the idea is or what we're supposed to be talking about, you've kind of gotten rid of them. They're not really there anymore. But if you don't impose at all, you just kind of let them do whatever they want, you're not really there. There really isn't a facilitator. You're not able to push them in order to expand their capabilities beyond what they've done before. And it sounds like your invitations are one way of translating the idea into like leadership within an academy, where you're not imposing fully by just enforcing some vision on people, but you're still offering an invitation. And sometimes they have to be a little bit stronger. Sometimes they're invitations that do really feel like a requirement. But there's this element of receptivity rather than mere compliance. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, it is. And I think it's important in, so we'll stick to my party analogy that I've invited you to. You have to know where the party is. You have to know where it isn't. You need boundaries and parameters around that. So that might be, again, I'll think of an example. We were doing some pretty innovative work with curriculum. Well, people need to know, you have this many credit hours to spend, not that many. So your solutions can't be asked. So you got this many credit hours. It needs to be done by this. Providing some structure and boundaries. You got this much money to spend with it. You can't do that. And giving, I just think that structure kind of defines the playground a little bit, what you can and can't do. And I learned that the hard way early on. Very early in my career, my last career, a leader delegated to me and 3 or 4 other people this task. We were excited about it, and we really worked hard on it, and it felt innovative. And then when we brought it back, I was like, well, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. So, and it was really deflating. And so a good invitation lets you know what's available to you and provides boundaries so you don't even have to go the other space. So
when I think about an invitations framework for being a good leader, that's very visceral for me. It's very much connected to my own practice as well, because that's the primary way that I've tried to offer feedback to people who I'm training. I invite them to explore with me the puzzles that they faced in their practice, and then I offer them some ways of overcoming the things that they identified as important. And I'm wondering if, is that the way that you offer corrections as well? And do you ever find a need to kind of go beyond the invitations framework when, as a leader, you really need to rein in some chaos in a significant way?
Yeah. Sometimes no's a complete sentence. And there'll always be, as I said, not too tight, not too loose. And if you have an environment where you sort of unleashed people, that's cool. Everybody I hire should be smarter at what we hired them for than I am, or what was the point. But absolutely, there are times you need to do that. You need to do that all the time. Not everybody who started working in my environment finished working in my environment. Not everybody is successful, but this is where, and many other elements as well too, but this is where kindness and compassion can come up. I've reflected a lot personally on mentorship. At one point, mostly people were very successful in our environment, and a few were not. And when I reflected on that a lot, because I do think as a leader, when someone isn't successful, I know I'm going way down a rabbit path here. You just yank me back whenever you want. When someone isn't successful, I have to reflect on my responsibility for that in terms of selecting them, supporting them, recruiting them, all of that thing. But the other side of that, and probably the last 8 years of my deanship, the only thing I gave attention to, or the principal thing I gave attention to in hiring faculty, was do they have the capacity to benefit from mentorship? Because if you can do that, you can do anything, or you can be successful. So what is the prerequisite to be able to benefit from mentorship? It's to be in the presence of somebody that you trust, somebody you feel safe with, somebody that you think is, but I'll stop there.
Well, no, thank you. I mean, I think this ties really clearly to something you said earlier, which is you can have all these defined roles within a hierarchy, but the ways that we actually interact with one another, like from behind those roles, really matter. You can have a formal mentorship relationship set up, but if you don't actually have those feelings of trust between the mentor and the mentee, it's not going to be effective. And you can't just assume that those feelings are going to be there. You have to actually earn them.
Yeah.
You have to do the work to do that. That's one of the things that I found so inspiring about the story that you told at the beginning. When I think about my relationships with my own students or my own people who I train in facilitation, I think about what I need to do to become the sort of person who's actually deserving of their trust. And it's something that I think about every day, because I feel like one of the biggest successes I could have in life would be to actually be worth their trust.
Yeah. You know, when I was first appointed dean, there was a president about my height who wore a bow tie, and I met with him, and he told me that there were two things I needed to know to be a successful dean. He was right about one of them, wrong about the other. The first one was have a sense of humor. That is correct. The second is have a thick skin, and I guess that works. But I think my approach to leadership is not that way. I'd like to think about leading with an open heart, so that there's a mutuality in the relationship. I allow myself to feel you. I allow and that doesn't mean, we're all one big happy family. Everybody gets to set their own boundaries. I know grandchildren of some of the people I hired, and I don't know anything at all about some of the others, because that's what they want. But the point is to lead with an open heart is when you're in the presence of someone who feels kind, that's a powerful thing. But it takes, to me, it does take, kindness is such a simple little thing, but it does take a bit of courage.
Yeah. So on the subject of courage, there's one final topic that we're going to talk about before we jump into a Q&A. One of the toughest things for a lot of us is to engage in conflict well. To engage in conflict with an open heart. And it's something that happens, I think, when we engage with one another with an open heart. If I'm completely closed off and I just present like a nice polished version of myself to you and you do the same thing to me, it's possible that we might be able to avoid conflicts, at least for a long time, because we're not really engaging with each other. There's not enough of each other in the room for the parts that would lead to conflict to even emerge or bump into one another. But when we have a campus community that is trying to do something important and we're engaging with it with, some of the most important interests that we have, the things that we love, our ideas, our commitments, when all those things get put into the mix, we get conflicts. And one of the things that you and I have reflected on is kind of this too tight, too loose distinction when it comes to conflict, where one thing you can be is like a crisis phobe, where you're so afraid of a crisis emerging that any chance that there's a conflict, you just run and hide. You're willing to hide so much that you might even, Ernest Becker talks about forgetting your own name. You just kind of shrink down and then you're not even seen anymore. But then there's also this crisis philia where anytime you see something wrong, you're like, let's just go burn the whole thing down. I'm going to jump into a conflict immediately and have it escalate to crisis. And a tough thing about living with one another in a community is that we have to find this like virtuous middle path between crisis phobia and crisis philia. And I'm wondering if you might be able to just reflect on the role that leaders can play in helping people, find this middle path.
Yeah, and I'll put that in the context of disagreement and conflict.
Yep.
So I said at the outset, I think this is all a lineage. A long ago leader of mine in my last career told me and had a sign right here over his left shoulder, if you and I agreed on everything, one of us wouldn't be necessary. And I think that's really, really important. And I also think it makes a huge difference on how we disagree. And maybe this is the most important, or one of the most important contributors to creating an environment that is twofold. One, where we can really create and innovate, and we remain ethical, right? We make right decisions, which is, among other things, a point of the shared values, right? I wanted to so there's a right way to do it, and I think, and I can talk more about it, leaders have a role for structuring how we can engage in a process where disagreement is healthy, and I do want to distinguish it from the reflexive cynicism we see in the academy sometimes. It's like, could you tell me what you believe in so I could know what I don't? I'm not talking about that. That happens a lot, but it's about that thoughtful, or disagreement that assigns motivation. If you think about your most recent conflicts, if I think about every disagreement I ever had with my wife, it wasn't what I did, it's what she thought I meant, and kind of the same. So we want to invite disagreement that is curious. We don't want to act like it's not frightening. Conflict for most people is unpleasant. But we can create, and you think about in this context too, our whole point in the academy is to contribute to and to create new ways of thinking and practicing and viewing the world, while the people that created the old ones or live in the old ones are holding on to them. Because change is frightening. So we always have to bump that. So I think one of the principal roles of the leader in any context, but particularly here, is to take as much fear out of an organization as is possible. I think fear is an antidote to creativity. And fear might make me, I don't know if it would, I haven't made widgets, but you might be able to frighten me into 10 widgets a day instead of 8, maybe, I don't know. But I don't think most people are frightened into being creative and innovative. So there's all kinds of things I can think about that in terms of practice, but
yeah, thank you. So 2 things that came out of that was a commitment to curiosity when we have a disagreement. You want to make sure that we're actually curious about what the other person means, rather than simply listening to try to hear what we disagree with. The other thing I heard you talk about was one thing that we in the center put under the banner of charitability, where we're being generous with the motives of other people. We're not simply hearing a disagreement and from there making an inference, an unfounded inference often, about what their motives and character traits are. And so I love that. One thing that is difficult is to take that really good advice and put it into practice. And when I think about great social movement theorists like Martin Luther King, when he describes the steps of a social movement campaign, one of the earliest steps is self-purification, where we have to sit down and kind of look within our own soul and do what we need to do to make sure that when we actually engage in conflict, we do it with the right motives rather than the wrong motives. And I'm wondering if you have any advice for how we can engage in something like self-purification so that we can have these great ideas about curiosity and compassion and courage and charitability and generosity, and take those ideas from things that we'd like to see and then change ourselves so that they actually manifest in our behavior.
Yeah, yes, and I'll take it down to just an individual level too. Leadership doesn't just happen in your head. Leadership's an embodied practice. And for me, when I'm in the middle of a challenging conversation, and what I teach to people I mentor is to check in with your body first. And everybody who's going to lead, everybody should have some kind of personal practice, I think. Mine is meditation. But we practice meditation so we become aware of our body, we become aware of our thoughts. So if you and I are in a conflict, you're going to notice that I'm sitting up straight. My feet are on the floor. If you can't see my shoes and I'm feeling really freaky, I might take them off and just really ground myself. Take some breaths, be fully present. Over your shoulder when I was dean, because I sat here and you sat there, was a little statue that, and I won't get into it any further, but it was a reminder, for me to be fully present. So first, as an embodied practice. And then the second thing is, it's more important to listen to what is being said than to who's saying it. If you've been engaged in leadership long enough, what can happen when you're not fully present is you fall into this pattern of allowing this interaction be the average of the last 50. And then you miss the opportunity to hear something different or hear something really, really creative.
Yeah, thank you. So I hear the importance of an embodied practice where we're thinking about what we need to do to engage in the space that we're in. How do we have to arrange our body so that we're prepared to have a conversation?
And your breath.
And the breath, yeah. The breath work. I think about embodied practice a lot in my own stuff. I've been on stage a lot. I was a violinist before I got into philosophy. And one of the things that I'll do is if I'm about to go on stage and I don't really know whether I'm nervous, I'll just check my pulse. And that'll tell me whether I'm nervous. Because sometimes you can't tell. Sometimes you can't tell. And so you have to kind of ask your body how you're feeling sometimes. And then I think just noticing what your pulse is can be a way of like just observing it without judgment. And then that can be the thing that gets you prepared. Thank you for that. I'd like to transition into a question and answer period. So what we've done is I have cameras. I've recorded everything that we've done so far, and I'm going to put this on YouTube. But what happens next, I'm not going to keep. I'm not going to put any of that on YouTube. And part of the reason for this is that I want the next 23 or so minutes to be something that we just have in this room for each other. I want you to be not afraid to take risks. If there's a question you want to ask that you don't want to be kept forever, you can do that. And so this is just one way that we're going to offer an invitation to you to be creative with less fear. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much, Tom. This was a wonderful experience. Thank you.